In the midst of a raging national debate about the Pittsburgh attack and the policies and ideology of President Donald Trump, how did the Jewish vote play out in the midterms this year? Well, historically, there has been bipartisan agreement for Jewish voters around combating anti-Semitism and supporting Israel. But despite having a US president more supportive of Israel than ever before, Donald Trump's deeply polarising policies and approach to leadership is at the centre of American discord, and the impact has been significant on the Jewish vote. Now, a new poll shows that under the current domestic climate going into the midterms, American Jews remain ever more deeply entrenched in the Democratic Party. J Street, which commissioned JBA Strategies to conduct its annual election night poll, saying the Trump presidency has led Jews to vote even more Democratic than at any time since beginning their election night Jewish polling in 2010. But another leader is also impacting voter sentiment when it comes to the Jewish state, the policies of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, the feelings were mixed towards the Israeli Premier, Netanyahu's favourability falling from plus 30 in 2014 to plus 12 in 2016, and it's now dropped to a 9-year low of plus 3. Now, when it comes to the priorities of Jewish Americans, it shows that gun violence is high up on the list, of 28% after healthcare at 43%. Israel, though, sits second from the bottom of the list at 4%, down from 9% in 2016. But while Jewish Americans are not voting on Israel, they undoubtedly have a strong emotional attachment to it. Now, to make sense of these figures and what this poll suggests about Jewish American attitudes to Israel, President of J Street, Jeremy Ben-Ami, joins me from Washington, D.C., and former AIPAC State Director of Minnesota, Iowa and Indiana, Eric Gallagher, joins me. Pleasure to have you with us, gentlemen. Now, of course, the Jewish community saw a string of anti-Semitic attacks in the lead up to the midterms, from graffiti on Jewish centres to the Pittsburgh shooting. Eric, to you, this survey shows that 72% of people polled believe that Trump's comments and policies are very or somewhat responsible for the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. What do you make of that?
Well, I think in the community there's definitely a rising sense. Was that directed to me or Jeremy?
It was directed to you, Eric. It was directed to you.
I apologize.
Thanks.
It's a little difficult to hear.
I do think there's a rising sense. I do think there's a rising sense that most Jewish Americans feel that anti-Semitism is rising. The Anti-Defamation League has been for a long time talking about the urgent need to address extremism on the right wing. And I think also with the rise of the BDS movement on college campuses, there's also an unease in left-wing circles as well. So I think for a lot of folks, particularly those who are actively involved in the Jewish community, there's a sense that things are changing. However, I still think by and large, we recognize how fortunate we are to live in a country like this. The outpouring of support has been really terrific. On the poll, I just want to say one thing on the poll specifically. I'm not surprised. It's no surprise that Jews lean left. Historically, the American Jewish community has leaned left. President Trump is not that popular among American Jews. It's also not surprising that American Jews are very opinionated on Israel's domestic policies. I think what would have been really interesting is if this poll, if the J Street poll had asked the respondents if they thought whether they thought the United States government should interfere in Israel's domestic affairs. I think the overwhelming majority would have said, regardless of our opinions, Israel's a democracy. We respect Israel's democratic process and its electorate. And I think they also would have said, if they were asked this question, that the relationship should remain bipartisan. I think there are elements on both the right and the left that are trying to turn Israel into a wedge issue, into a political football. And I don't think that's right. And I think the overwhelming majority of American Jews, as evidenced by the growing numbers at the annual AIPAC policy conferences and the growing numbers of young people coming into the movement, I think they would agree that the relationship should remain bipartisan. And regardless of their views on Israel's domestic policies, nothing Israel does in the territories or elsewhere diminishes the strategic value of Israel to the United States of America.
All right, Jeremy, of course, your organization commissioned this poll. What's your response to that?
Well, I do think that the question of whether or not Americans, quote-unquote, interfere in Israel's domestic policy needs to be unpacked a little bit. I think that the notion that the United States government or somehow officials from the United States might seek to interfere in Israel's domestic politics, of course that's going to get overwhelming negative response from American Jews. But I do think we ask the question of whether or not one can criticize the policies of the government of Israel and still be pro-Israel. And the answer to that was a resounding 82% yes. And I think that that's a really important shift in the way that the American Jewish community thinks and operates. I think there was a time when a group like AIPAC or groups that were more in the establishment would say that basically you simply needed to support whatever it is that the government of Israel does, and that's the only way to be pro-Israel. And I think what the poll shows is that as we've gotten into an era of Benjamin Netanyahu, of settler-driven Israeli government, of unending occupation and ever-deepening conflict, that it is possible to say one loves the state of Israel and one supports the country and the people, but one is also very critical about the policies that it's following. And I don't think that's interference, and I do think you would find overwhelming American Jewish support, and we did find that, 82% thinking you can be critical of what Israel's government is doing and still be pro-Israel.
All right, and of course we've seen a particular trend when it comes to the young American vote. So to you, Eric, what do you think is contributing to the growing divide between young American Jewry and the state of Israel?
Well, I think Jeremy made a lot of good points. I think it's very positive that you see actually an increase in engagement and interest in Israel among young people. You know, one of the things that I always find striking is, and Jeremy, please don't take this as a swipe at J Street. It's not. At the AIPAC Policy Conference on an annual basis, particularly in the last few years, there have been more students than there are. I believe there were people at the GA and people at the last J Street National Gathering. I do think that young people are engaged. You have a lot of young progressive candidates. These are not just Republicans. These are not just religious people. These are not just people within the Jewish community. You know, the Gallup poll back in March found all-time high support for Israel among the American public. And by the way, that also went for Democrats. And you have progressive candidates, Jewish progressive candidates like Alma Hernandez, good friend of mine, who is a Latino Jew who just won in the state legislature. She's part of a wave of progressives who are, I think, beginning to define the Democratic Party. And a lot of them are actually quite pro-Israel in the traditional sense, meaning they have their views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on what Israel should do vis-a-vis the West Bank settlement policy, but they believe that the United States, if the United States is not interfering in the affairs of its of autocratic allies, it certainly would be unbecoming of us to interfere in Israel's democracy. Israel is a really robust democracy. I think there is a structural problem, which is that we live in a very, very partisan climate. And I do think that particularly young people, particularly in the Jewish community, don't like President Trump, and they don't like that he has a great relationship with the Israeli prime minister, who had a not-so-great relationship with a progressive president, Barack Obama. So I think the problem is structural. It's not unprecedented. This has happened, and I think we need to resist efforts to get hysterical and alarmist over this and simply realize that regardless of what people think, I mean, I think it's a great thing that now people think they can criticize Israel, and it's not anti-Israel. I've never thought it was anti-Israel. I think it's a great thing. But I don't think that means that the Jewish community, even with shifting views on issues like the Kotel, on issues, on opinions of Benjamin Netanyahu, I still don't believe that there's this, even among millennials, this idea that we should do the types of things that maybe J Street or groups on the right like ZOA would like to do, which is take positions that are very controversial within Israel. I actually think J Street is a great organization. I sometimes would feel more comfortable if it were lobbying the Israeli government in Jerusalem rather than lobbying Washington.
So then a question to you, Jeremy. Those surveys, as you say, overwhelmingly believe that someone can criticize Israeli policy and still be pro-Israel. So what do Americans believe that Israel stands for or should stand for? And then how are its policies not measuring up to that?
Well, I think there's three areas that I often cite that are leading to this distancing. And again, I don't think that young American Jews are walking away from Israel. They are very engaged, actually, in this, but they're engaged in a rather, critical way. But I think that's better than walking away. I'd rather have people arguing than ignoring Israel. I'd say the three issues are, number one, whether or not we in the United States who do not practice Orthodox Judaism are Jews. That is something that is getting under the skin of every non-Orthodox American Jew who cares about these issues. 90% of us are not Orthodox, and yet the establishment in Israel doesn't recognize us as Jews. And even in the wake of Pittsburgh, the chief rabbi in Israel wouldn't refer to the Tree of Life Synagogue as a synagogue. So I'd say that's area number one. Area number two is the challenges to Israel's underlying the strength of its democracy, whether or not it is attempts to limit the freedom of speech or of organizations that are critical within Israel to operate, whether it's turning people away at the border, whether it's passing the nation-state law and elevating the Jewish status of the state over its democratic status. I think those are challenges to Israel's strong democracy that are very worrisome to more liberal, younger American Jews. And then third, and overwhelmingly, is the question of occupation, is the question of what is going on the West Bank, and how is it that the state of Israel, a military and regional and economic superpower of 8 million people, is ruling over millions of people, dominating their everyday life and not allowing them to have political and civil rights. And I think that occupation, pluralism, and democracy are the three core challenges. Okay,
Eric, we don't have that much time left, but I want to pose a question around that to you. Is it hard to make assessments on Israeli policy around perhaps the last point that Jeremy pointed to, when one isn't intimately familiar with the realities of life in Israel?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, no, I think the case for Israel is still very strong. Look, Israel's predicament is a very, very challenging one. And this is one of the reasons why I think well-intentioned groups on the left and right that try to pressure Israel to do things and to take risks that its electorate doesn't feel comfortable taking, they fail to realize that, Israel's under attack. Israel's under attack from the Gaza Strip, which it left in 2005. There's a massive threat on Israel's northern border funded by Iran, Hezbollah. Keep in mind, Israel left Lebanon. And so in this context, for Israelis who are worried, these are life and death situations. For Israelis who are worried about security while they're under attack, for the United States government to then pressure Israel to change policies in a third territory after vacating 2 territories and receiving over 20,000 rockets in return, and the specter of a very bad war with Lebanon and Iran, which would be very tragic. I think it's tone deaf. I think a lot of people in Israel, that kind of pressure historically has had the unintended consequence of pushing Israelis away from feeling comfortable in taking risks for peace.
All right. Now, Jeremy,
I think that case makes a lot of sense.
I just want to let Jeremy respond. We only have about 30 seconds to go. If you can, Jeremy, what's your response to what Eric had to say?
No, look, I think that we have the utmost respect for the security concerns that Israelis live under, whether it's Hezbollah in the north or Hamas in the south. But when it comes to the question of whether or not the Palestinians living on the West Bank should continue to live under occupation without political rights, that's not a security issue. If the security establishment of Israel really believed that hanging on to the territories was a security issue, then the question is, do you provide political rights for those who live there? And right now, Israel is not making a decision between keeping the territory or
Jeremy,
providing
unfortunately, we're out of time, but we appreciate that insight, of course, from you at J Street, and Eric Gallagher. Thank you for being with us here on Perspectives.